Here. How you doing, Benjamin?
Good, how are you?
Doing pretty good.
Everyone else?
Hi, Ben. Can you see me? Where am I here?
You gotta do it.
Yes. Here we go. Where am I? When am I here? Okay, good.
You're very mysterious. There we go.
How you doing, Crystal? Crystal, thanks a lot for spending some time with us today. We're sorry we're running a little bit late today, but just to kind of give you a bit of a preamble as to kind of what the objective of this class is, what we're doing, the work we're doing with the UNF, CCC, and other institutions, so it can kind of frame the lens or the prism through which the information that you're about to share with us today, and we're about to enter into discussion with you, the lens through which that is going to be sort of received and applied. Okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, good.
My video froze a little bit, but
Okay, good. I assure you it's only the video and it ain't me, okay? A lot of things, but frozen isn't one of them, okay? Okay. So what this is, and the course tomorrow as well is also an iteration of this, is what we teach in this class and what we're sort of spearheading here at Yale is a sort of a new communication systems, which we call humanistic communication systems, wherein science and protocols related to science and environmental challenges are sort of communicated through a values-laden lens that is still scientifically correct, but allows us to sort of include values in both the analysis, interpretation, and application of the data towards, in this discussion today, application, resilience, etc. Right? And so one of the things that we focus on as traditionally communications, as you well know, has been, we were just talking about this in class before we convened with you, but traditionally what sort of happens is you have your sort of adaptation plans, protocols, discussions, you bring the stakeholders together, you arrive on a particular adaptation policy or resilience strategy, and then you sort of turn to communication strategists to kind of like communicate the shit, okay? That's not what this is. Here we're talking about is communication being an upstream partner from the get-go so that each of the stakeholders can learn to communicate with each other so that the product that you ultimately produce represents already the communication strategies that have been applied that allows those stakeholders to actually come up with something meaningful and hopefully that mirrors this collaboration. So we're about facilitating that towards essentially then a new product, and then you develop talking points based on a new product, that is the byproduct of these upstream communication strategies. And what we're training in is those communication upstream strategies that allow, for example, science to talk to religion, religion to talk to media, media talk to policymakers, policymakers to talk to community activists. And these are all different languages, and the classes is learning bridges against those various communication silos, or to sort of those communication silos to come together. And so one of the projects we're doing towards that end is a project with Paul DeSanker to essentially begin to develop upstream communication strategies for the implementation and uptake of adaptation protocols towards soliciting and receiving funding, through NAP, et cetera, sort of more downstream. And so Paul is actively involved with the undergrad course and the grad group, I guess less the undergrad course, but a group of researchers to sort of develop that and to actually produce a white paper come April or May towards that end. And Paul's working with us once a week to develop that. And so Paul couldn't be here today. He very generously, suggested you, and we're delighted to have you. And so what we want to learn about, obviously, we've read the materials that you suggested, and we want to learn more about adaptation from you. And enough out of me.
Right. Okay, great. Well, that's some good context, and just to preface anything else I say, it's actually rather interesting how you frame that, because one of my interests is one of the things that I look at in collaboration with some other colleagues of mine is the whole challenge around undertaking what is sort of called quote unquote applied science or research around adaptation. Because the whole goal of that is basically to provide some useful information to some kind of stakeholder out there that has to make a particular decision.
Right.
But yet we're sort of relying upon these very traditional funding mechanisms, design mechanisms to facilitate that process. And fundamentally, researchers such as myself or many others out there aren't really trained in how to communicate with different types of stakeholders. We speak one type of language and expect everybody else to catch up. We don't understand how to be effective in policy environments because it's a mystery to us. It's a black box by and large. And so we actually have a paper that we've submitted that and I've written some other stuff on this, that sort of fundamentally tees up this issue of, we have a bunch of researchers that are relying upon to sort of provide this foundational knowledge around climate change and how to adapt, but those folks really don't know how to communicate with the folks that need that information and aren't really the amount of work, interaction, engagement, and communication that's necessary to make that actually happen isn't appreciated, isn't costed, and isn't really effectively managed. And so there's this sort of big disconnect between what we'd like to be able to do and what we think we should be doing and what we're actually doing. So that's just some stuff that's on the top of my head right now. And some other stuff on the top of my head, I'm working on a OECD report on sort of risk-based approaches to adaptation planning. And, if you look at any risk management paradigm, communication, consultation is clearly identified as one of the things that we're supposed to be doing throughout the process of assessing risk and developing ways of managing that. But again, that's something we do rather poorly. And again, it's always something that's sort of tacked on the end as this thing. Well, now we have a product, let's figure out how to communicate it. So I'm very sympathetic to that preface. Seems very timely. So with that, what can I tell you about the messy business of adaptation?
I think class, you want to ask? Let me put that question to the class. Angie, you have a question brimming? No, right now. Anyone have a question? Okay, I think, let's begin at the beginning. What we're focusing on, for example, this week and next. First of all, next week, by the way, we're specifically addressing risk and resilience, as well. And if you have some time, even 20 minutes, 15 minutes next week, we'd also like to take that up. If not, that's fine. We can figure another time. But essentially, I think let's begin at the beginning. I think that one of the way the class is organized is each week we essentially take so let's call it sectors in the climate change, science arena, and we basically view those as narratives. So we view sort of opportunity narratives, transformation narratives, and the adaptation narrative is kind of what we're in the process of studying right now. And what we're doing is essentially want to sort of give us a grounding of your work in adaptation. They've read your paper, an introduction to adaptation, and then what we translate that is essentially into a story, about adaptation that allows narrative interventions, for better communication of the adaptation story. But we need to begin at the beginning. And I don't know that everyone in the class, even though this is a very sophisticated bunch, is really keen or really as invested and as well informed about what adaptation is and why it is. Certainly in my work in communications, I have moved from mitigation strategies to adaptation communication strategies. And I not only have done that because we clearly are having such trouble meeting our mitigation standards and mitigation goals, I've also done that because in a way, reaching and achieving successful communication applications in adaptation allow us maybe to back into mitigation, because adaptation basically opens us up to social, political, cultural contexts, social systems, and even ecosystems, which the language of mitigation is much more problematic to enable us to do it. So I'm actually kind of backing into sort of the mitigation, debate through adaptation. So from our standpoint, adaptation actually provides us a rhetorical sort of portal and a rhetorical strategy that mitigation alone doesn't. So it's a really kind of but in order to fully engage in this, we've been studying sort of various mitigation communication strategies up to this point. We only now are turning our attention to adaptation. So I think essentially pretend you're on NPR and the anchorman is saying, what the hell does adaptation mean? And pretend we have, double-digit IQs, not triple-digit IQs, and take us from the beginning in terms of your work and also a little bit of biographical detail about what brought you, to this area of research as well. So how does that sound? Is that okay?
Awesome. Yeah, great. Okay. So that's a lot, but I think I can handle it. Let's start. So let's do the biographical stuff, because you guys are sitting there and staring at this weird looking dude on the screen and probably trying to figure out what's his deal. So at the moment, so I work for a big Department of Energy national laboratory called Oak Ridge National Lab. It's tucked away in eastern Tennessee, outside Knoxville, and its claim to fame was, of course, one of the places where uranium was enriched for the nuclear bombs that were used in World War II, and subsequently it moved on into peacetime activities. I'm the deputy director for a climate change science institute at the lab. It's about 100 people. We're all doing work on different aspects of climate change. I've been here 5 years. Before that, I was actually down in Australia, in Melbourne, where I worked for effectively the sort of national research organization down there, doing climate change impact assessment and adaptation work. That's where I really sort of got into the adaptation arena. It's also where I started actually doing work with stakeholders on the ground. So that's where my sort of experience for that comes from. Before that, I was in Washington, D.C. for a number of years working for a place called the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, which is now known as the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, where I was sort of the climate change science guy, and provided advice to other folks in the center, a lot of folks on Capitol Hill, business community around what's going on with the science, what are the consequences of climate change. And before that, I was basically a postdoc or a graduate student in university. So I grew up in Atlanta. I did my undergraduate work at the College of William and Mary and my PhD at Georgia Tech. So I'm a bit of a scientist by training, a real proper sort of biologist, I guess, marginal biologist by training. But I kind of left the pure science stuff whatever are we now, almost 15 years ago, and really sort of interested in the sort of interface between where the science around climate change meets the sort of risk management. What do we do about it? So that's my background. I know I've done a lot, and it's hard to believe because I look so young. But believe me, it's all real. So what is adaptation? I think the preface about originally the deal was about mitigation, right? Which is very much the sort of looking at climate change like a pollution problem. We have too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and therefore we have to figure out what is a safe level of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases. Develop regulations that reduce it to that safe level. And then, boom, off we go, we're safe. And adaptation was, for many folks, was considered a dirty word, right? So even folks like Al Gore talked about adaptation as defeatist, I suppose. There was a prominent author in Australia who talked about it as being akin to genocide, like we're just going to sit back and try and adapt, that we're basically allowing consequences to unfold. But I think eventually people realize, well, it's actually really difficult to mitigate greenhouse gases. It's very difficult to find that quote unquote safe level of greenhouse gases, and even more difficult to get people to take action on a time scale that would sort of avoid those consequences. And I think the other thing is, people observing consequences of climate change right now. So the idea that we're going to prevent consequences is sort of gone out the window as people realize, oh, this is already happening. What can we do to manage risk? Okay, so what is adaptation? I mean, originally, as it was conceived, it was designed as quote unquote adjustments that we make as society or on behalf of, for ourselves or on behalf of natural ecosystems to adjust to the anticipated changes in the climate system. So anticipating what's going to happen in the future, anticipating the consequences that could arise, and basically preparing ourselves for those consequences as a way of reducing, avoiding consequences and risk. One of the interesting things about adaptation that sort of really distinguishes it from mitigation has been the fact that it's, I think, probably largely pursued more from the bottom up. And by that I mean at the local level. So instead of, if you're a small community, a small island state, for example, you don't have a big greenhouse gas footprint. You want the international community to mitigate greenhouse gases, and that's probably very important to you, but you yourselves are not really going to have a big role to play in mitigation. But adaptation might actually be very, very important because those impacts are going to be experienced locally, and you're trying to figure out what can you do as a community, as a nation, to protect yourselves, avoid risks to your own community, to your own nation, and not simply sit around and wait for the rest of the world to figure out what they're going to do on mitigation. So that's the general idea around adaptation. It's been linked to a number of other, research areas, other areas of practice in environmental management. It's generally considered very closely linked to disaster risk management. So, the least developing countries that Paul works with, for example, for them, adaptation and disaster risk reduction are very closely aligned. It's also increasingly linked to the concept of resilience. It's linked to the concepts of sustainability, vulnerability reduction, et cetera, et cetera. So you can kind of choose your own vocabulary around what is adaptation and how you want to use it. And I suppose my real entry point into this, I mean, I started out doing really focusing my work on mitigation originally. So 10 or 15 years ago, everybody was focused on mitigation. I was focused on mitigation. My work was sort of looking at if you were to mitigate climate change by a certain amount, what are the benefits? What does that get you in terms of avoided damages or avoided consequences from climate change? But when I started working on projects, particularly in Australia, where the whole idea was, well, let's try and look at this issue of climate change at sort of local level. So sort of community-based climate risk, community-based thinking about adaptation and risk management. And when you start working at the local level, it ceases to be this big global problem where all you're thinking about is how much is the temperature going to change and what's a safe level. And you start thinking about the problem in its local context. So you're looking at the problem sort of through the eyes of in their own community. And those folks have their own preferences around take what kind of consequences they are concerned about, right? Because if you're living on a coast, for example, you're concerned about one class of consequences from climate change much more than other types of consequences. So when you get down to these sort of local level, things start to look very, very different depending upon what perspective that you take. And the other thing is that when you get down to the local level, you're basically getting into normative, sort of subjective preferences around things. You're getting to what do people perceive to be the risk? What do people perceive to be the appropriate response options? What are so you move sort of out of this very sort of reductionist, objective quantification of what the impacts of climate change are going to be, and move more into this sort of subjective, normative, what's important to me, what's important to my stakeholders, and that may or may not, be consistent with what the sort of objective analysis is. So just a sort of practical example. So some of the work, I did a lot of work in Australia working with coastal communities around assessing their risk, their vulnerabilities to climate change, and how to adapt. And one of the things that we observed is local governments and local communities were very concerned about the effects of sea level rise on their communities. But when you actually do the analysis, sea level rise was a fairly minor risk compared to things that were more frequent or more common or have bigger impacts, things like wildfire risks, things like flood risk. So those are things that probably there's greater exposure to, they happen more frequently, and therefore you would think, well, this should be a big topic for local government to focus on. But in reality, they were less concerned about that. They were concerned about sea level rise. Why? Because it was a novel risk, because the regulatory framework that guided local government decision making on dealing with sea level rise wasn't well established. And because you had a lot of high value assets and property tied up in that thin coastal margin that might actually be exposed to sea level rise.
By novel risk, do you mean a surprising, exotic, or do you mean something else by when you say novel risk?
Yeah, I was wondering if anybody was going to call me out on that. So by novel, I suppose a risk that lies outside the range of risks that people have experienced in the past. So, in other words, folks are quite familiar with variability in sea levels, and they're familiar with certain types of extreme events, like some kind of coastal storm that causes a storm surge. So they're familiar with that. But when you add sea level rise into it and say, well, you're familiar with this risk in this context, but if you add sea level rise in, that means you might get something like an additional meter of sea level by the end of this century. What do you do about that? And how does that additional driver affect your calculation of risk, and what do you do about it? Mm-hmm. And that's something that, local governments in particular weren't really equipped to handle, not only because of their own experience, they haven't experienced the next century of sea level rise, right? So what do they do with that? And a lot of it came down to, as local governments, in Australia at least, they sort of execute state policy. So in the absence of state government saying, okay, this is how you should manage this risk of sea level rise, they're sort of left to their own devices, and therefore simply didn't know what to do and were afraid of sticking their necks out to do something. And so you get into these complex issues where it's not just about how much sea level rise we're going to get, but how do people feel about that? Is there some kind of regulatory policy framework in place that provides guidance on what folks should be doing? So it gets to this it's not just about risk of sea level rise, it's about how we make decisions around that and how we govern ourselves. So who's responsible for managing this kind of thing? So in that work, you start to see how stakeholders who actually have to deal with these decisions sort of respond to these kinds of situations. How do people in the real world respond to risk? And back to where we started and where you guys are working, how do people in the real world internalize messages around climate change, around adaptation, around risk? What's relevant? what's useful, what do they actually understand. And this actually, seeing this firsthand, we as researchers get into large amounts of jargon, right? So something as simple as vulnerability or risk, words that mean something to everyone, but a researcher might say, well, I mean something very, very specific about this. So, and that's something that, non-academics and lay people, we may not necessarily appreciate these sort of subtleties and nuances and the baggage that we can attach to simple things we're trying to communicate. So anyway, and before rambling on more, some of you look like you're in pain. I might pause there for.
I can assure you just the opposite. I think this is fantastic, and I think the class would agree. And it's fantastic what you're sharing, Ben, and it's really helpful to go back. And one of the things to return to one of the things that you said that I think is really important. Is one of the sort of basic tenets of our work here is that we as a communications as a matter of communications principle and communications strategy is we don't focus at all on trying to persuade people that climate change as a category is happening or not. We totally let go of that. And instead what we focus, on is essentially bringing it down, as you say, to local, regional, cultural, social, political context. And then essentially, what is the manifestation, possibly, what is a manifestation of sort of climate change, let's call it a symptom of climate change, or a climate change, possibly climate change related event, flood, drought, sea level rise, et cetera. And what happens is when we want to engage a community simply about, let's say, sea level rise, and let's say you get a certain degree of uptake and concern, as you've demonstrated, about sea level rise, and then that, in turn, precipitates a conversation of perhaps, either government inaction, the inequity issues, the social and political domain that sea level rise kind of, speaks to. You then move the debate and you move the conversation to a conversation about governance, to a conversation about values, to a conversation about how do we define, sort of who we are in relation to the people who might actually help us control the risks of sea level rise. And all of those involve sort of a variety of communication strategies. But the point I'm making, to your point, is that once you've done that, you actually are completely outside the obligation of convincing people that climate change is real or not. You're dealing with the doing, and the whole issues, all of the issues that are going to allow us to address climate change, addressing inequity, addressing governance, addressing, the baselines and assumptions upon which we govern, that none of those, unless those issues are addressed, climate change won't be addressed. So adaptation and the narrative adaptation essentially allows us to come clean on issues of governments that are implicated at the macro level, but at the macro level, absent the local and regional sort of adaptation sort of narrative, we're never going to get anywhere. To wit, we're in this sort of trap. So we invest really, really heavily in adaptation for that reason, precisely because of the ability to translate the perceived risk or the believed risk, of let's say sea level rise as an example, a climate change, event. How probable it is or how certain it is beside the point. It is the perceived risk, and how the perceived risk gives you a portal through which then adaptation and sort of climate change by implication can be addressed. And that's why I have personally been so interested in your work. And when you nailed that, I just wanted to highlight that because I think it's a really important trajectory.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, that triggers a couple of things. I might pause just in case anybody else around the table has a
question. Yeah, forgive me for hogging the stage. Forgive me, but yeah, please. Does anyone have anything to? Please, I'm glad you said that, Ben, because I'm not being the best co-facilitator here of my own class. So, guys, something. Yes, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Adam. The question I'm always interested in when I get to read people who write papers is, what are the things that you're most unsure about, or the kind of problems in working on adaptation and working in these communities with which you're not satisfied with your own answers?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, you've revealed the IQ there, so you gave it all away. But so I mean, I guess one of the I think I can kill a couple birds with one stone here, but um, I suppose the where a lot of adaptation research has covered a lot of ground, right? It's everything from helping the Corps of Engineers design a more resilient levee to ethnographic studies around what folks in sub-Saharan Africa are using in terms of information that will help them manage subsistence livelihoods, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, one of the things that I've obviously focused on, and there's been a sort of eruption of research around, is what are the barriers to adapting to a changing climate, right? And so there's this whole literature on this that I've contributed to, and I think we're at a point now, and studies continue to come out at a fairly rapid rate, and I think I stopped reading that literature because it doesn't really matter whether you're talking about a case study from sub-Saharan Africa or a case study from central United States or wherever. It all comes down to the same sort of list of factors, and it's a long list of factors. And so I think there's an advantage there that I think we've done the work that we had to do, which is not just assume that hey, climate change is real. We've convinced you. You know what you need to do? Go out and adapt. That's kind of ridiculous, and been enough work now so where we know, and we've done work with stakeholders to know that going to them and saying, "Hey, go adapt to sea level rise," for example, they throw up their arms and go, "Are you kidding me? Yeah, first of all, you guys haven't told me what I need to adapt to in respect to that, and second of all, do you know how many other things that I'm supposed to be doing in addition to that?" So we really identified all these barriers, but then the question becomes, so what? Okay, so we know people need finance. We know there's problems with coordinating governance and decision making across scales. We know there's social, political, religious obstacles to people taking action. We know people want more knowledge. The list goes on and on. And there's sort of common challenges no matter where you are, even though the context is slightly different. But what we haven't focused on, I think, is, okay, now that we've identified all those barriers, how do we actually overcome them, right? So all we've really done is help, in addition to, we basically spent a lot of time telling people climate change is a problem, there's going to be consequences, and then we spent a lot of time telling people, here are all the challenges that you're going to face or you are facing in dealing with that problem. But we haven't invested a lot of time and energy in figuring out how we overcome those. I think part of that is a lack of appreciation for communication. So I think, there's been a lot of folks beating up on the communication channels around climate change, how scientists are bad communicators, et cetera, et cetera. And I think all that's true. The flip side of that is, I don't think you say, well, if we'd only communicate better, we'd be able to solve this problem.
That's exactly what we study in this class. Yeah, Brendan, keep going. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's the whole package either. But ultimately, I think from my lack of satisfaction is I've done enough research and read enough research that I know that this is hard, and adaptation is hard, just like mitigation is hard, perhaps for slightly different reasons, but in many ways for some of the same reasons. And we haven't really empowered people with tools to try and overcome the barriers. And in fact, overcoming the barriers to adaptation is probably your first step in adapting. And it gets into, and part of that is certainly building capacity to overcome barriers. And I think that's something that Paul's probably very, very familiar with, and something I focused on a bit in some of the work that I've done. But I think that's sort of the frontier that we haven't really really gotten ourselves, we haven't really sort of figured out how to manage. And, I think one of the other things we do as researchers is when we feel like we've used up one sort of avenue of research, we invent a new avenue of research. So, lots of folks, so adaptation is really popular, but now people are talking about resilience, and so that's become sort of a buzzword that people are using. Other folks are talking about transformation. As another buzzword that people are using. And I understand the sort of intellectual merit behind a lot of those, but then folks that I know who work on the ground in local government, for example, they come to me and they go, Ben, what the hell are people talking about? We're just still trying to get our heads around what adaptation means. And now you're telling me, no, adaptation's out the window. We're supposed to be making ourselves resilient, or we're supposed to be transforming ourselves. What are you guys doing to us, right? So, and I think, but I think that does lead back to the communication thing. Like, what are we communicating, and why can't we deliver a consistent message over time? But so hopefully that addresses that particular question. But I wanted to circle back on this issue of perception, because I think one of the other things you learn when you actually go out and talk to people is that people don't always perceive things the way you expect them to. There's some interesting work. So some work done out of the UK, and when it comes to heat waves, extreme temperature, and who are the people most vulnerable or susceptible to that, it turns out to be the elderly generally, and people are getting older sort of around the world. So that's one of these things sort of highlighted, as always highlighted from a public health standpoint of climate change. How do we protect those vulnerable people and the elderly, who are elderly? You got to talk to elderly people and say, oh, aren't you vulnerable? Don't you feel vulnerable? They go, what are you talking about? I don't feel vulnerable. And we see this sort of again and again. I've done my own work on looking at coastal vulnerability in Australia, and had people call me up on the phone to say, how could you label our community as vulnerable to climate? We have a wonderful community here. And then I've got a graduate student who's working in Australia, and she's been out talking to households in coastal communities about their perceptions of climate risk versus other types of risk. So are you going to lose your job? Or is your kid going to run away from home? Or are you going to have a significant, health problem, et cetera? And one of the things that she's observed there is, and we've talked about this, and the way we frame this for a paper we're getting ready to submit is around narratives of resilience. And there are these sort of competing paradigms where you have people whose own narrative is one of resilience. People don't like to perceive themselves as vulnerable, as at risk. People like to think of themselves as pretty on top of things and ready for whatever comes. Mm-hmm. And I think Americans are like that to a large degree, and Australians are very much like that. But at the same time, there's this sort of other narrative of not resilient enough, right? So nobody is going to say, oh, we got this climate change thing handled, we don't need anything else, right? Particularly not folks in, say, positions in government organizations, local government, state government, federal government. So you have to juggle these two different narratives of, one, we're resilient people, we pull ourselves up our bootstraps, we can recover from, disaster, while at the same time entertaining this narrative of we need to build capacity, we need additional resources, climate change poses unprecedented risks that are novel that we haven't seen before. And so her data, my students' data, is actually quite useful at illustrating how you have both of these narratives going on at the same time, but obviously they conflict or are perceived as conflicting And then you have to think about and wonder, what does that mean for being able to pursue an adaptation agenda if people don't actually perceive, a problem actually exists?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, I'd love to talk to you more about that. That's really relevant to my work, both in the private sector and here, Ben. That's really fascinating. And one of the things that, we focus on here in our work and research and here as class projects is ways to essentially transpose, this sort of belief in one's resilience, into sort of, a variety of actions, such as essentially taking action and adaptation and then breaking down exactly what that might mean. And it might mean first entering the debate about governance, towards that adaptation, towards that adaptation solution. And I really like sort of this, and we work on it a lot, we call it breakthrough communications, a way essentially to take what would normally be opposites, which is, I basically don't want to be told by Al Gore that I am vulnerable, just like you just said. I don't want to be told by him. And who the hell is he to tell me I'm vulnerable, But yet weighing that against essentially saying, okay, well, you're not being vulnerable. Let's leverage this sense of resilience you have about yourself, and let's actually leverage that positively into you taking action. And the question is, then what is the action? Well, is the action ultimately going to be building levees and firewalls? Well, of course not. And essentially, so what happens there? And then developing communication strategies once you have essentially sort of this framework where we want basically to develop a communications framework whereby people's own unoffended sense of resilience can be transposed into action in a particular case study in South Florida. How do you do it? How do you move it forward? So I would really like to talk to you more, about that work that your graduate student is doing as well, because I think there's actually some case studies I'm working on right now, particularly in Florida, where that would apply.
Yeah, and I think one of the things on that note, one of the other things I wanted to sort of talk about is, you have to sort of get at what do people want.
Right.
And at some level, you can say, well, people want to adapt to a changing climate, right? And if you ask people that, some people might say yes. You'll probably get that more from, say, some government organization or agency, because it's part of their duty of care to help prepare communities. But in reality, I think, people want, safe, and they want to live in safe, sort of resilient, communities where they turn the tap and water comes out and they flip the switch and the lights come on. And I think this is one of the reasons why the narrative of resilience has gotten traction in recent years. And it's been a combination of sort of adaptation, sort of set the stage, but then particularly in the United States, what did we see? We saw, I think Hurricane Sandy in particular was one where it was sort of this reminder of, yeah, look, big risks aren't 50 or 100 years down the road. They're right around the corner. And thinking about what do we do to deal with this sort of additional risk posed by climate change, that's a nice consideration, but we're probably kidding ourselves if we think we're really well prepared to deal with the types of risks that we experience every day and in the present. And so that I think, this is my personal opinion. I've got no idea really, but that sort of helped reframe this challenge away from, how much is climate going to change and what do we have to do to prepare ourselves for some future climate state at some distant point in the future. And it's really a much more fundamental thing around, how do we address people's needs and desires to, live in safe, robust communities. And when you enter from that standpoint, I think, again, it leads you to a different type of discussion. So if that's what you want, something much more basic and probably much more tangible to many people, let's have a discussion around what does that involve? And the climate change might be one of the latter things that you get to in that discussion. But some of the more earlier sort of items on the list of how we get there are still relevant and useful for building sort of longer term climate resilience.
Yeah, well, first of all, Brent, thank you very much. I hate your mindset. We have to do this all over again tomorrow. I promised you it was going to be only 20 minutes, so I hope I hope you're okay. Hope you're okay with that. But I think on a closing note, I mean, I think that's and in this, with your permission, this conversation to be continued. I promise we'll be respectful of your time. But this notion of climate change actually providing an opportunity to host these kinds of conversations about governance and provide a kind of connective tissue, allow us to view climate change less as a communications albatross and more as a communications opportunity to have the discussions that we should be having, that climate change and its manifestations give us an opportunity to do. So it's sort of kind of trying to flip the whole paradigm.
Yeah, and I'll keep running my mouth off you. So if you guys have to get up and leave, go ahead. But
Yeah.
one of the, I mean, I agree completely. It's been interesting the number of times that I've, been out working a barbecue grill at a national park somewhere and sharing it with somebody, and they've come up to me and said, "Oh, what do you do?" And I work on climate change, and they go, "Oh," and boom, that triggers a discussion. I think climate change, if your students aren't familiar with the concept of a boundary object, it's worth checking out. But I think climate change sort of acts like a boundary object in the sense that it's this thing which for many people is very intangible, but everybody seems to have a connection to it, and it's the sort of vehicle for having a whole variety of conversations around equity, around energy, around desirable futures, around risk, and governance. And so I agree. And so it's I think it's useful to focus less on the sort of specter of climate change and figure out how do we have discussions and conversations that actually take us in directions that a larger group of people probably want to go anyway.
So Ben, I'll be in touch with you. If you could give us, next week we are addressing risk and resilience. If you can have 15, 20 minutes, it would probably be more, but if we could at least if you're in the mood this time next week, we'd love to have you back. We think you're great, okay? So if you're willing, you can look at your schedule if that could work, and I'll be in touch with you by email, but I want to thank you a whole hell of a lot. It's been great. Great. Thanks. Okay.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm happy to help out.
Okay, great. Thank you. Take care. All right. Thanks a lot, Ben. All right.